Wei disliked my humble background and took my child away as soon as he was born. When Wei Zimu was 5 years old, Wei wanted to marry his sweetheart as his concubine. I heard him say, "Wang comes from a noble family. It's a good match for her to marry Dad." He pushed me away and said, "I don't want a maid to be my mother." I was stunned for a long time after hearing this, and then calmly asked for a divorce letter. 7 years later, when I returned to Beijing, Wei Zimu rushed over and carefully pulled my sleeve. "Mother." I gently pulled back my sleeves and asked him with a faint smile, "Young master, have you seen my son Xianling?" His face turned pale instantly, and he stared at me blankly.
1. It was a cold and snowy night.
I carried the medicine that I had been boiling for half a day and hurried to Quizhuxuan step by step against the wind and snow. The people at Quizhuxuan said that the young master had caught a cold and refused to take the bitter medicine, and everyone was very anxious. I added stevia leaves to the prescription and spent half a day in the small kitchen boiling it. It has been more than half a month since I last saw him. Since he was born, he was raised at the old lady's residence, which is very far away from the courtyard where I live. Furthermore, they did not want me to see him often and kindly allowed me to see him only once a month. The child was taken away from me on the day I gave birth. I dragged my body, which had just given birth, and knelt down to beg Wei not to take my child away. He was unmoved and just said coldly, "With your background and knowledge, can you ask yourself if you are capable of raising a child?" Song 1. Parents who love their children will plan for them in the long run. Can you bear to let him down? The Wei family is a century-old royal family. The eldest son, Wei, holds power, and many noble ladies flock to him. And his children should be extremely noble and should be the model of a noble family, with bright future and shining like the moon. I looked at the red face of the baby in the cradle and slowly loosened my hand. This relaxation lasted for 5 years. At first, I always sneaked to Quizhuxuan just to take a look at him. At that time, the child was less than 1 year old and was sleeping soundly in the cradle. I looked at his fair little face and didn't even dare to reach out and touch it for fear of waking him up. Later, when he could walk, Wei would hang the sachets I embroidered on him. He would come to my yard on the 16th of every month, a small man who would stumble and greet me. Then she opened her dark eyes and looked around the room curiously, pointing at the sachet on her body and then at me. "Mother embroidered it, I like it." I pinched the handkerchief, turned my head suddenly, and tears flowed down. It doesn't matter. I always think that as long as my son grows up healthy and safe, I can endure any amount of suffering.
2.
When I arrived at Quizhuxuan, the maids and servants in the courtyard were walking back and forth, and no one paid attention to my arrival. They all knew that Wei was estranged from me, and the old lady was extremely disgusted with me. I was not worthy of anyone to cling to in this mansion. I asked the maid to wait in the corridor, picked up the food box, and walked to the door according to my memory. Just as I was about to push open the door, I heard a voice coming from inside. The old lady has always been dignified, but in front of her only grandson, her voice unconsciously slowed down. She must have been talking to another person in the room. "The Wang family has already agreed. You should find a good day and prepare for the wedding." I thought about the rumors in recent days. Wang Huishu, the eldest daughter of the Wang family, had just returned to Beijing from the border. She and Wei were childhood sweethearts and had been engaged, but when the Wei family fell, the Wang family hurriedly canceled the engagement. Wei didn't respond for a long time. After a long while, I finally heard his voice, low and cold. "I haven't told her yet." "Who does she think she is?" Madame Wei snorted coldly. "Just marrying her as a co-wife is already the greatest honor given to her. Could it be that she wants to make trouble?" It turned out that he was marrying a concubine. I thought that way Li would demote me from wife to concubine for her. But none of this matters. The only thing on my mind is my sick child. At this moment, a childish voice came from the room, saying in a baby voice, "Wang is from a noble family. It would be best for her to marry Dad and become my mother." As if to persuade his father, the child said in a hoarse voice, "Aunt Huishu is very kind to me. Mir likes her. At that moment, I just stood there quietly, letting the wind and snow blow all over my body. The food box in my hand left a deep mark on my wrist, but I was completely unaware. Until drop after drop of tears fell on the back of my hand. The scorching heat brought me back to consciousness from the ice and snow. I raised my hand to wipe away my tears, then resolutely pushed open the door in front of me. When you enter the house, you can see the whole scene. Old Madame Wei was sitting in front of the bed, holding Wei Zimu with one arm, while Wei Li, a tall and strong man, was standing beside her. The three of them were startled by the sound of me opening the door and looked over at the same time. Wei Li was dressed in a blue shirt, with his long hair tied up with only a jade hairpin, and his eyes were full of coldness. I just looked at Wei Zimu, but when I looked over, he buried his head in Madame Wei's arms, not letting me see anything. I retracted my gaze, gently put down the food box, and stood 10 feet away from the three of them. I said calmly, "No need to tell me specifically. I agree, but I hope that the Marquis can give me a divorce letter before the marriage." Wei Li looked at me suddenly. His dark eyes seemed to stare a hole in me. Divorce? I raised my chest and looked him straight in the face. Yes. Seeing this, Madame Wei frowned and said, "Song-won, don't go too far. Although you saved the Wei family's life, the Wei family has given you the position of legal wife and provided you with good food and drink over the past few years. You should have repaid the favor long ago. Now that Wang is the legitimate daughter of the Duke, for the sake of Lear, she is willing to lower her status and enter the mansion as a co-wife and is on an equal footing with you. What on earth are you still dissatisfied with?" Wei Zimu, curled up in her arms, might have thought that our quarrel was intended to prevent Wang from entering the mansion. After Mrs. Wei finished speaking, she jumped off the bed, took 2 steps towards me, raised her hands, and pushed me hard. When he came towards me barefoot, I subconsciously squatted down and stretched out my hands to greet him. I looked at his flushed face worriedly, stepping barefoot on the cold ground. Therefore, I was unable to defend myself against his sudden attack and fell heavily to the ground. I looked up at him in disbelief, but he said with red eyes, "I don't want you to be my mother. How can a lowly maid be qualified to be my mother?" After Wei Li was stunned, he dragged him to the bed and shouted, "Wei Zimu." I looked at the scratch on the palm of my hand, and when I stood up again, I vaguely saw a smile flash across Madame Wei's lips. What else am I dissatisfied with? I have no dissatisfaction. I have no complaints even if Wei Li wants to marry a wife and take a concubine. Even if he wanted to demote me to a maid in the mansion, I wouldn't care. In this mansion, my only hope and joy is the child I will give birth to after 10 months of pregnancy. When I gave birth to him, I almost had a dystocia and heavy bleeding. I was in pain for 2 days and 2 nights before I finally brought him into this world. I have suffered all kinds of contempt and humiliation and have lived in a corner of this mansion. As long as I can see him every day, I will be satisfied. But now, this child that I once exchanged half my life for has become a sharp knife, stabbing straight into my chest. A 4-year-old child has already been enlightened and knows what is superior and inferior. Therefore, he disliked me, his mother of humble origin, because I made him lose face. 3. To be honest, it was because I didn't want to think too much about it. Wei Zimu had already distanced himself from me. In the early days, he would stick close to me and look forward to the 16th day of every month to come and see me early. On that day, he would take out the snacks that he had secretly hidden and offer them to his mother as if they were treasures. But gradually, he seemed to hate the 16th of every month. When that day came, he would either have schoolwork or practice swordplay. I racked my brains to no avail, so I could only run over with a smug look on my face. Sometimes I would just take a peek from a distance, and then a maid would come to tell me that the young master had too much schoolwork to do and couldn't spare the time to see the lady. Occasionally, when he was willing to see me, I would pick up a handkerchief to wipe his face, and he would subconsciously avoid me. I thought he had grown up and had his own thoughts. But it turned out that he disliked me. But what he said was indeed right. I was originally a maid in the Wei mansion. That year, the entire Wei family was framed and thrown into prison, with no one spared. I happened to be out on the day the Wei mansion was ransacked. When I came back, I heard from the officials that the eldest son of the Wei mansion was thrown into a mass grave and left to fend for himself. I hesitated at the door for a few seconds, wondering whether to leave or not. What flashed through my mind was the time when I was first sold to the Wei mansion. I was only 12 years old at that time and was bullied by the housekeeper because of taking care of the flowers and plants in the garden. That day, he was causing trouble for me as usual and asked me to kneel on the ground and lick the surface of his shoes clean. I knew that he wanted me to follow him and serve him in bed, and I was unwilling to do so, so I was made difficult for him everywhere. Just as I was about to kneel down, the 14-year-old Wei Li took the bow and arrow in his hand, aimed at his head and shot. What a great authority! I didn't know there was a servant like you in my mansion who bullies the good. That was the first time I saw him, a young man as gentle as jade, full of vigor and vitality. I couldn't read very well, but after Wei Li taught me, I came across a line of poetry that was enough to describe Wei Li when I first met him. The piled-up stones are like jade, the rows of pines are like emerald, and Lang Yan is unique, and there is no other like him in the world. Finally, I went to the mass grave and dug out the 16-year-old Wei Li. The bright moon falls down to earth, but its moonlight is still bright. At that time, Wei Li had injured his leg, and coupled with such a major change, he was in a moody state and was not in a good mood towards me. I boiled medicine all night, and he smashed a bowl and said, "Get lost." I didn't say anything, but just patiently boiled the medicine until the 38th bowl, when he finally drank it. Later on, those days that followed were probably the happiest times between him and me. In order to support him, I started a business with some money, selling wine, tofu pudding, and bamboo baskets, and I learned many skills. I will give him the money I earn. I know he is working hard to redress the injustice done to the Wei family, and I believe he can succeed. While he was out there, I took care of the Wei family members in prison for him. Every month I would save money, buy clothes and food, and visit them in prison. Especially since Madame Wei is old, the clothes and food I make for her are particularly fine. She would often hold my hand with tears in her eyes and say, good child, I'm sorry for the hardship you have suffered." Later, the Wei family was restored to power, his injustice was redressed, and he was released without charge. The moon is hanging high in the sky again, and its light still shines on me. However, I am not greedy. I am just repaying the favor I received when I was 12 years old. I think it would be better if Wei Li could give me some silver as a reward. I can open a restaurant in Beijing and borrow the Wei family's name. No one will dare to bully me, so I'm sure my life will be great. However, Wei Li stopped my bag and asked with lowered eyes, "Why are you leaving? You don't want to marry me?" My eyes widened and I waved my hands quickly. "I am not worthy of you, young master." He grabbed my hand and smiled like clouds and mist. "As long as I like you, you deserve it. Who cannot be moved by the moonlight of youth? And now, as long as you nod, this moonlight will belong to you alone." So I nodded. However, I didn't think at that time that how could the friendship between husband and wife in a wealthy family be maintained by just a word of affection? After getting married, Wei Li finally realized that I was really a burden to him, and my identity was really difficult to talk about. Every one of them was married into a noble family and had a strong influence in official circles, but he was the only one who married a maid. As the years go by, when the words heart and joy fade away, what comes to mind is unbearable and unworthy. 4. I returned to my room and packed out all the personal belongings I had collected over the years. There were also some head ornaments and jewelry, which I asked my maid Chiulian to pawn and exchange for silver. I am alone, and if I want a divorce, money is the most important thing. I am not that noble. While packing up, the servant reported that Wei Li had arrived. I paused for a moment, then lowered my head and got busy again. The room was not well lit, and Wei Li was tall and blocked most of the light as soon as he came in. He saw my actions and frowned. "No matter how much you make a fuss, marrying Wang is a done deal, and there is no way to change it." I ignored him and he slowed down his tone again. She's your equal. No one dares to suppress you. If you still don't like it, she will live in the West Courtyard in the future, and she won't come to you when she has nothing to do on weekdays. I put down my burden and took another step back. If a divorce is a hindrance to you, a divorce letter will do. I don't care. Wei took another step and grabbed my wrist, his face stern. Song Lianxiang, Wang sure can't be reduced to a concubine. Don't push your luck. I was stunned. Song Lianxiang, this was my name when I was a maid. Later, Wei said, there is a beautiful person, clear and graceful, and he named me Wan. Now, he mentioned this name again, probably to remind me to recognize my own identity. In fact, at the beginning, maybe because of love, he treated me very well. As the morning light fades, my husband draws his eyebrows. But later on, friendship could not withstand the passage of time, and people's hearts are always fickle. Just as I was about to speak, a gentle female voice came from outside the door. Muir, you're feeling better now. Don't be too anxious to walk. Another voice responded obediently. Thank you, Aunt Huishu, Muir knows. Seeing this, Wei said calmly, having Wang as Muir's mother is a good thing for him. You have always loved him, like your lifeblood. If you act recklessly, aren't you afraid that he will blame you when he grows up? I remembered that when Wei Zimu was 3 years old, he accidentally contracted smallpox. After careful consideration, Madame Wei asked him to move out of Quizhuxuan. At that time, Wei was not in the capital, and I had no way to save my son. I could only keep begging them to give me the child. If you can live, please give the child back to me. He is still alive. I was alone holding Wei Zimu, hiding in the woodshed in the backyard, taking care of him day and night. It was also from that time that I began to consciously study medicine, and I would read medical books in my spare time. After Wei Zimu recovered from his illness, I fell seriously ill and almost died. Later, Madame Wei took him in again and loved him even more. This child, who survived a great disaster, will surely have good fortune in the future. He is a blessing to our Wei family. In the past it was Wei Li, and later it was Wei Zimu. Everyone knows that they are my life and my Achilles heel. So, they used it unscrupulously to force me to compromise and swallow all the suffering. If it were in the past, I would have just swallowed my rice with my tears. But now, I don't care whether it's Wei Li or Wei Zimu. I didn't look up and organized my bag in a clear and orderly manner. I have already drafted the divorce agreement. Please sign it. The laws of this dynasty stipulate that if a couple is not harmonious and divorces amicably, they will not be punished. Both parties only need to sign or stamp the divorce agreement as proof. Wei took a look at the divorce papers spread out on the desk, stepped out of the door, and threw down a few words. Have you ever thought that if you leave this door today, it will be extremely difficult to come back in? I still didn't look up, and estimated in my mind that I would be able to leave in about 2 days. 5. Wei walked out of the yard and ran into the child head-on. Father. Wei Zimu greeted him, and it was obvious from his face that he was not feeling well. This child's eyebrows and eyes are very similar to Songwan, and it can be seen how handsome he will be when he grows up. Wei lowered his eyes and said, Go and talk to your mother for a while. Maybe after seeing this child, Songwan won't be so stubborn anymore. Wei Zimu looked at the courtyard deep inside, then looked back and said hesitantly, It's rare for Aunt Huishu to come here. Grandmother said that Muir should be polite. She is leaving, and I want to see her off. He lowered his head and said, I can talk to my mother anytime. Wei waved his hands and didn't care much until Songwan took the divorce letter, a maid, and a bundle and walked out of the Wei mansion. Everyone finally realized that Mrs. Wei had really left. She didn't want her husband and even didn't want the son she loved so much as her life. On the day Songwan left Beijing, Wei stood on the city wall with his son and watched from afar. He didn't say anything to keep her, but just stared at the figure coldly. Although the 4-year-old Wei Zimu was not very sensible, he was a little anxious and pulled his father's sleeve. She left? Why did she leave? Wei did not reply to him. Wei Zimu, lying on the wall, asked again, Will she come back? He thought no one would reply, but after a while, Wei said to him confidently, "Yes, as long as you stay here, she will be back within half a month." He didn't even bet on his own weight in Songwon's heart. He only talked about Wei Zimu. Before leaving, Wei Zimu looked back at the carriage going away, pouted, and said angrily, "Go if you want to. I still have my mother." But later, no one expected that Songwon would be gone for 7 years without any news.
6.
Spring flowers bloom, autumn leaves fall, and 7 years pass in the blink of an eye. As the Xian family's carriage was driving back to Beijing, I was still a little dazed looking at the scenery along the road. In the carriage, Xian Jingnian leaned on me like a boneless person and said coquettishly, "How come this carriage is moving so fast? It's already reached the capital in less than half a month." He is tall, with long arms and legs, and looks like a cold-faced devil outside, able to stop children from crying. She is like a different person at home, and even snatches toys from her son. I pushed his head away and said unhappily, "You still think it's too slow? I'm worried that Langer won't get used to it over there. There are many nobles in the capital, and he's very active. I haven't slept well these past few days." The Xian family is the most prominent family in Longchuan. They have lived in Longchuan County for generations and have to return to Beijing to report on their work every few years. In the first few years, Xian Jingnian's father went to the capital. This year, the emperor named him and asked him to go with him. Xian Jingnian knew about my past in the capital. On the one hand, he didn't want to be separated from me, but on the other hand, he didn't want me to go to the capital. It had already been delayed for some time, and later on, as there were some important matters to deal with, he postponed his trip to the capital for a few more days. Xian Lang could not wait any longer, so he followed his grandfather to the capital. Xian Jingnian sat up straight and held me in his arms. "With Dad here, who dares to bully him? That old man treats him like the apple of his eye, so just relax." I leaned against his chest. So many things had happened in the past 7 years that I could no longer remember some of them. But I do remember clearly the scene when I first met Xian Jingnian. He was very young at that time, and his father threw him into the military camp for training. After a battle, he was lying on the ground covered in blood, holding a piece of grass in his mouth. The medical officers and female doctors were all assigned to treat the wounded soldiers, and since he was just a small soldier, no one cared whether he was dead or alive. It wasn't until I was hurrying past with the medicine box in my arms that he reached out and grabbed my foot, almost making me trip. His face was covered in blood, so that his features could not be seen. He grinned with his big white teeth mixed with blood. "Dr. Sister, please have mercy on me and stop the bleeding." The many entanglements that followed are all a story for later. After arriving in the capital, we settled down at the post station. Xian Lang left the city and went to the Xian family army camp outside the city to prepare to enter the palace. I think my father left a letter when he left. As soon as we arrived, a servant came to report that Xian Lang was taken to Luan Hall by his grandfather. Luan Hall has always been a gathering place for scholars, so I drove there in a hurry. 7. At this time in the Luan Hall, the elders were discussing affairs in the hall. 2 children were standing in the yard, with their swords drawn. Wei Zimu, who was already 11 years old, had a tall and straight figure, dressed in silk and satin, with his long hair tied up high. The child opposite him was not even 5 years old, with a pair of big watery eyes and a chubby face, which made him particularly adorable. "Give the sachet back to me." Xian Lang reached out to Wei Zimu angrily. Wei Zimu held the sachet in his hand and asked again, "As long as you tell me where this sachet came from, I will return it to you." Xian Lang said angrily, "I already told you. This sachet was made for me by my mother." "Impossible," Wei Zimu retorted subconsciously. "You must have picked it up somewhere, or someone else gave it to you. No one is more familiar with this sachet than him. He also has one on him, but it is not as new as the one in his hand and has been worn out for a long time. Only his mother knew how to embroider this kind of sachet, and she was used to embroidering a song character in the shape of an animal on the bottom of the sachet. He is the only child his mother has, so she couldn't possibly make this sachet for someone else." He became more and more eager to know, so he forced the child in front of him. "Don't lie, who gave you the sachet?" Since childhood, Xuanlong's mother taught him to be polite and well-mannered, and he always listened to his mother. But his father was a bad guy in Longchuan, and Xianling had been the little bully of Longchuan since he was a child. No one had ever dared to treat him like this. So, he no longer cared about etiquette and gathered all his strength to rush towards Wei Zimu. "Give me back my sachet," he yelled. "I hate you." No matter how hard he tried, Wei Zimu held the sachet high up and looked coldly at the 5-year-old kid whose eyes turned red with anxiety. Perhaps realizing that he had gone too far, he pursed his lips, wanted to put his hand down, but then raised it high again. Finally, Xianling wiped his tears and ran into the hall. "I will tell my grandfather that you bullied me." Wei Zimu looked at his figure, retracted his gaze, and held the sachet tightly. He wanted to take it back to show his father. As long as he had the sachet, he would be able to find her. At this time, a servant came to report, "Where is young Master Xianling? Your mother is here to pick you up, and she is waiting at the door." When Wei Zimu heard the word mother, he was distracted for a moment, pointed to the inner hall, and walked towards the door. When they arrived at the door of Luan Hall, the maid took out the token, stuffed some silver into the doorman's pocket, and asked him to inform the gatekeeper. I got out of the carriage, waited aside, and stood on tiptoe to look inside. As the door opened, a servant came out to meet a young man. I walked past him and looked inside. But I saw the child stopped and then came towards me like a gust of wind. The servant behind him said in surprise, "Young master, watch your step." I was so startled that I took a step back and someone suddenly pulled my sleeve tightly. I looked down and saw a pair of red eyes staring at me. "Mother." I looked carefully, and from the familiar eyes and eyebrows, I remembered the child from 7 years ago. Wei Zimu. 7 years have passed. He should be this old now. I saw a sachet hanging around his waist. It was so old that the fabric was worn out and didn't match his fine clothes. I remember that I sewed this for him when he was 4 years old. But later, he disliked me and threw away the sachet in front of me. Because before that, he received another sachet from Wang Huishu, which was exquisite and beautiful, and very different from the styles I made in those years. I shook my head. I had other concerns in my mind now, and besides, there was no relationship between him and me anymore. Seeing him coming out, I gently pulled back my sleeves and asked politely with a smile, "Young master, have you seen my son Xianling?" What? He raised his head, not knowing which word of the whole sentence he should hear, and just asked blankly. I was about to speak when he interrupted me hastily. "Mother, Dad will be happy to see you back. Dad, and I have been waiting for you. Can you come back with me?" At this time, Xianling ran out from the door, threw himself into my arms, and rubbed against me coquettishly. "Mom, Langer misses you so much." I lifted his face. The child's nose and eyes were red, as if he had been crying. But when he saw me, he grinned hard again. My heart tightened. I picked up the handkerchief and carefully wiped his face, then asked, "What's wrong? Who bullied you?" As soon as I finished speaking, I clearly felt that Wei Zimu's face beside me turned pale. Only then did I notice that he was holding a sachet tightly in his hand. It belonged to Xianling. Xianling also saw the sachet in Wei Zimu's hand and shook my hand aggrievedly. "Mom, he stole my sachet." He raised his head, looked at me unwillingly, and confirmed again and again. He called you Mom? Is he an adopted child?" Wei Zimu thought of a solution on his own. "No problem. I can treat him as my own brother." Xianling sensed something was wrong and patted his chest anxiously. "You are talking nonsense. I am the son of my mother and my father. I am my mother's biological son." I held Xianling's hand, quietly comforted him, and said to Wei Zimu sternly, "Young master, please return the sachet to my son. He is only 11 years old now." When he heard what I said, the tears in his eyes suddenly fell to the ground. But I just looked at him, stretched out my hand, and waited for him to return the sachet. Xianling is my child. I can't let him suffer these grievances for nothing. As for Wei Zimu, if he wants justice, his father and mother will support him.
8.
Come to think of it, I am also a little curious as to why he has such an attitude now. After all, in those years, in order to let Wang into the family, he and his father pushed me into a desperate situation. Now that he sees me return, his first concern should be that I will ruin his reputation. But none of this matters anymore. I took the sachet, squatted down, and tied it around Xianling. At this moment, Wei Zimu suddenly called out, "Father!" I paused what I was doing, then patted Xianlang's clothes as if nothing had happened, and stood up. Over there, Wei Zimu was still pulling Wei Li's sleeves hard, urging him presumptuously. "It's mother, she's back. Father, please talk to her quickly." He looked at me while looking up at his father. Tell her that Muir knows she was wrong." Xianlang pulled my hand and raised his little face. "Mom, don't be unhappy. Dad will be sad." I pinched his little face and said with a smile, "I'm not unhappy. Seeing Langer, mother doesn't know how happy she is." I looked at Wei Li. 7 years had passed, and he hadn't changed much. Even his clothes were the same as the ones he was wearing when I left. I don't know what they thought of me all these years. Wei Li walked up to Xianlang, squatted down, and asked the same question as Wei Zimu. "Is this the child you raised?" He is somewhat similar to Muir. You didn't return to Beijing all these years because of this child? In your heart, Muir can be replaced by anyone, right? After so many years, he is still stuck in the past, the yesterday when I would be heartbroken for them father and son. I said coldly, "Lord Wei, this is my own child. He is never anyone's substitute." Wei Li lowered his eyes slightly, then stood up and spoke in a slower tone. "Okay, it doesn't matter whose child it is. Since he recognizes you as his mother, then he is also my child." He called Wei Zimu over and pushed him in front of me. "Look at him. In recent years, whether it's academic studies, writing, archery, or hunting, he has always been the best." Wei Li paused, then continued. "He said that when you come back one day, he will show you all these things. Muir has not grown crooked." Wei Zimu raised his head and looked at me eagerly. I ignored him, carefully carried Xianlang into the carriage, and asked him to stay there. "Wei Li." I turned to look at him. "You should remember that you and I have already divorced. It's just a divorce. If you're willing, it doesn't have to count. I have already found a marriage for you. It is with the left censor-in-chief of the censorate. They will adopt you as their adopted daughter, and then no one will talk about you anymore." I don't know why, although Wei Li's words were calm, I felt that he seemed a little crazy. I didn't want to pay any attention to him, so I turned around and got on the carriage. Behind him, Wei Li suddenly spoke up. "I never married Wang Songwan. I have been looking for you for 7 years." Without any pause, I let down the curtain, held Xianlang in my arms, and urged the coachman to drive. Wei Zimu watched the carriage go farther and farther away and kept pulling his father's sleeve, anxiously until his voice became hoarse. She left again. "Why didn't you keep her?" Wei Zimu looked up at him, his eyes half filled with tears and half filled with blame. "It's all your fault. You drove her away." Wei Li curled the corner of his mouth, and the same sharp weapon stabbed into his heart without hesitation. "Don't forget, Wei Zimu, the last and cruelest blow to her heart was made by you."
9.
The carriage turned the corner and headed towards Wangxiang Tower on Changshan Street. Xian Jingnian had already booked a table in the tower. This afternoon, Xian Jingnian will lead the troops to report into the palace from that street. I held Xuanlong's hand and stood in a private room on the second floor, with a panoramic view of the scenery outside the window. After a while, the sound of horse hooves could be heard, and a huge crowd of people and horses stretched as far as the eye could see. Only then did I realize that the tea houses around here were suddenly filled with people watching the fun. Most of them were young girls. No wonder the team Xian Jingnian brought this time was mostly young soldiers under his command. At first glance, they were all passionate and heroic. As the team got closer, the figure in the lead became more and more conspicuous. Xian Jingnian was dressed in military armor. His eyes were as sharp as an eagle. He looked stern and cold, and the spear in his hand was cold. Perhaps it was because Xian Jingnian's aura was too terrifying. The girls spontaneously walked around him and only threw the handkerchiefs at the people behind him. Xianlang pointed outside happily. Mom, it's Daddy. His voice was not loud, but clear and pleasant. No one would hear it in the noisy crowd. Then, the next moment, Xian Jingnian, who was riding on a horse, cast his eyes over without any error. When he saw me, the corners of his mouth curled up slightly, and in an instant, it was like cold jade shattering and an iceberg melting. Everyone followed his gaze and looked at us curiously. At this time, someone spoke up. That's Madame Xian, right? I heard that General Xian brought his wife and son with him when he went to the capital this time. Madame Xian and the general are truly a perfect match, talented and beautiful. Look, their children are also very beautiful. Because of this performance review, we need to stay in Beijing for a few days, and for safety reasons, we did not hide these things. Only then did I turn around and found Wei Zimu, who had followed us without us noticing. He must have heard what was said just now. He looked out the window motionlessly, and the person he was looking at was Xian Jingnian. I don't know how he got here. His clothes were disheveled, his hair was messy, his forehead was covered in sweat, and he was holding a handful of papers in his hand. He turned his gaze back to me, his eyes darkening. When I passed by him, he grabbed me and said, "Mother." I was silent for a while. Then I said to him calmly, "Many years ago, I was no longer your mother." Mother. He was stubborn and didn't change his words. His voice was hoarse. "These are the poems I wrote over the years. The teacher said they're very good. Would you like to take a look?" I remember when he was very young and just learning to speak, his favorite thing was to recite 1 or 2 lines of ancient poetry. When he was 16, he couldn't wait to scratch his head and recite it to me. But later on, he was unwilling to do so. When I occasionally asked him, he would say, "Do you understand the artistic conception of this poem? If it is hui, forget it, there is no point in telling you." Of course I understand, because I'm afraid of being looked down upon and ridiculed by others. I learned everything during those years, but I was still not as good as them. I didn't take the papers, but just whispered, "Go home early so your family won't worry." Xianlang didn't let go of my hand the whole way. Although he was young, he understood everything. I was the one who frightened him, so he could only say things like, "Langer doesn't want a brother in his sleep. He is just like his father." No matter how arrogant he is outside, once he encounters something wrong with me, he becomes like a frightened rabbit.
10.
When Xian Jingnian came out of the palace, an official passing by politely invited him to have a drink. He took off his spear before entering the palace, clasped his fists, and declined, "Thank you for your kindness, sirs. However, my wife and children are still at the post station and have not settled down yet. I am in a hurry to go back, so I will not go with you." His bow really scared several old ministers. You have to know that before Xian Jingnian was named the King of Hell, he was a well-known tyrant in Longchuan. In the first few years, when he followed his father to the capital, he inevitably caused chaos in the capital for several days. Now people are able to be so polite and no etiquette. The old minister thought that the marriage of the young King of Hell was a good one, so he cupped his hands and praised, "It has been many years since we last met, and General Xian has become even more heroic now." At this time, Xian Jingnian narrowed his eyes and suddenly said to the right, "Lord Wei." Wei Liyuan didn't look away, but he had to stop and asked coldly, "What's the matter?" Xian Jingnian looked at him, with disdain in his eyes. He looked like a pedantic scholar with a pale face, thin and shriveled body. Wanwan was still a child before and had never seen a handsome and strong man like Xian Jingnian, so she fell in love with this skinny guy. Wei Li frowned, not liking his unreasonably critical gaze. "General Xian, please respect yourself." Xian Jingnian did not hide anything and asked, "I heard that the Marquis of Wei divorced a woman a few years ago. Have you been looking for her all these years?" This is Wei's family affair and has nothing to do with the general. Wei Li thought the rumors about him in the capital were indeed true. Xian Jingnian was extremely rude and had no manners at all. Xian Jingnian, have you never thought that if she dared to divorce you alone, there would be no chance for her to turn back in this life, so why do you still have the nerve to look for her again? Wei Li raised his hand. not understanding why he was so hostile. "Don't worry, General. I have already found her recently. It is only a matter of time before I can bring her back home." Xian Jingnian looked at him and suddenly wanted to laugh. It seemed that Wei Li never felt that the divorce was his fault. Every word, he said, put his Wanwan in a low position. He suddenly asked Wei Li, "Do you know my wife's name?" Wei Li looked puzzled and felt uneasy. "What does this have to do with me?" Xian Jingnian told him solemnly, "My wife's surname is Song and her name is Wan, which means to embrace the beauty of Wan Yan. She is a rare treasure in the world." After saying this, he turned around and left without even looking at Wei Li. From the palace gate to the Wei mansion, you only need to go around a street and walk another mile. Wei Li got off the carriage and walked a short distance into the door, but he stumbled several times without knowing why. Madame Wei didn't notice his expression. She just asked, "I heard from Muir that Songwon has returned to Beijing?" Humph. She must have suffered a lot out there and couldn't stand it anymore, so she came back. "You have been unwilling to get married for these years, and I am old. I can't take care of all your affairs. If you want to welcome Songwon into your family, it's up to you. But if she wants to enter the Wei mansion again, she must kneel 3 times and bow once outside the courtyard and come to me, offering me a cup of tea. Then I will not hold her accountable for the mistakes she made over the years." It seemed that at this moment, Wei Li truly knew his mother. He was arrogant, overbearing, and domineering. He looked down on his wife and regarded her as less than a footcloth. Wei Li smiled calmly, and every word was heart-piercing. "Why don't you go over and kneel down and offer me a cup of hot tea? Then see if you can snatch someone else's wife and make her my wife." 11. The post station residence provided to us by the government is a residence with a yard. That day, after I finished reading a book with Xian Lang, a servant came to report that a young man had fainted outside the door. I understood what was going on and went out. Sure enough, I saw Wei Zimu lying at the door with a flushed face, as if he had been fished out of the water. Putting aside old grudges, I am still a doctor and cannot ignore it. I brought him into the house, gave him acupuncture to temporarily reduce his high fever, and asked the kitchen to boil some medicine. Xianling followed my footsteps closely, glancing at the young man on the couch from time to time. "Mom, is he okay? Why hasn't he woken up yet?" Xianling asked eagerly. I put down the medicine bag and squatted down to his eye level. "Langer, I'm a doctor. No matter if the person lying outside is an old man or a child, I will save him. But this doesn't mean that I will leave you. Do you understand?" He nodded, came closer, kissed me on the cheek, and said sweetly, "Langa knows. Mother is the best." I turned my head and found that Wei Zimu had opened his eyes at some point and was looking at me quietly. "Are you feeling better?" I touched his forehead, and it wasn't as hot anymore. Wei Zimu lowered his eyes and didn't move until I moved my hand away. Then he looked up at me. I whispered, "Don't do this kind of self-harming method again. If the high fever doesn't subside, it will be fatal." His face flushed, and he pinched the corner of the quilt with his fingers. I can naturally see how he got this disease." As they were talking, Xian Jingnian came over wearing an outer coat and looking sleepy. He had to go out from time to time these days, accepting invitations from officials. Yesterday, he came back drunk and complaining of a headache. I handed him the tea in my hand. He squinted his eyes and rested his head on my shoulder, mumbling something. When his gaze turned to Wei Zimu, he suddenly came to his senses and straightened up. "What is this?" I looked at him and realized he was asking a question knowing the answer, so I said, "Wei Li's son." Just with this sentence, Wei Zimu's eyes suddenly turned red. Xian Jingnian felt a little sorry for his pettiness, so when I was about to send Wei Zimu away, he waved his hand and said, "We will be leaving in a few days and we won't be able to stay in the capital for long. If he doesn't want to leave, let him stay for a day."
12.
After receiving the approval, Wei Zimu sent someone to deliver the letter to the Marquis's mansion and then stayed obediently at the post station. He was still a little weak, but for some reason he managed to get up. All day long there was Xian Lang on my left and Wei Zimu on my right. No matter where I went, they followed me closely. Xianlang felt the most uncomfortable and didn't want Wei Zimu to touch the corner of my clothes. Wei Zimu pursed his lips and whispered, "I can teach my brother to read and write. The teacher said that I have learned it very well." Xianling shouted, "I don't want you to teach me. I'm not your brother, and I don't want to be your brother." He was unwilling to learn, and Wei Zimu felt disappointed for a while before thinking of other ways. The last second, he picked up a branch and started to gesture under the tree in a very methodical manner. The next second, he was reading aloud again, his beautiful words flowing out. Then, he cautiously raised his head to see my reaction, but was always disappointed. I knew he was trying his best to show me what he had learned over the years. In the past few days, I also vaguely heard some rumors about why Wei Li did not marry Wang Huishu in the end. That year, when there was only half a month left before the date set by the two families, Lord Wei discovered that the wife he was going to marry was not as virtuous, gentle, and considerate as the rumors said. On the contrary, she doted on Wei Li's only child on the surface, but in fact she secretly put chronic poison in his diet and even humiliated him at will when he was unconscious. The more important reason was that in the second year after that, Duke Wang Guo was thrown into prison for possessing evidence of treason. However, the Wei family escaped the disaster because they had never married into the Wang family. So 7 years ago, Wei Li did not marry Wang Huishu. There were many reasons, but it couldn't be because of me. I have just carefully examined Wei Zimu's body and there is no trace of poison in his body, so he seems to be fine. When Wei Zimu arrived, he saw Xianlang sitting on the Lanting pavilion with his feet crossed, and the maid who served him had gone somewhere unknown. He walked closer to him involuntarily, wanting to talk to him and ask him about his mother. When he was as old as Xianlang, his mother loved him and would always come to see him secretly. No matter how he made a fuss or treated her coldly, she would not leave. She would only feel that she had not done well enough. Xianlang didn't want to talk to him, so he turned his butt, faced away from him, and lowered his head to eat the candied fruit in his chest pocket. Wei Zimu reached out to touch him, but Xianlang shook his hand off. The two of them moved back and forth, and somehow, Xianlang slipped and fell into the pond. Xianlang flapped his hands and feet, crying desperately for help. Wei Zimu stared blankly, and a thought suddenly flashed through his mind. If Xianlang wasn't there, would my mother? No. He shook his head, and just for a moment, he put the idea behind him. Wei Zimu shouted for help loudly inside and jumped down. He had learned to swim and quickly caught Xianlang in his arms. After a while, a crowd of people came over. When I heard Wei Zimu's voice, my heart sank, and I ran over in a hurry. When I arrived, Xianjingnian had already fished the two children out. His eyes swept over the wet Wei Zimu, who was standing with his hands and feet tied and his head lowered. I ran towards Xianlang without any hesitation. He was so scared that he cried louder and louder and grabbed my clothes tightly. After waking up, I asked the two of them. Wei Zimu didn't say anything, but Xianlang looked gloomy, but he still spoke. Langer slipped and fell in. At this point, I didn't say anything else. 13. In the evening, Xianjingnian and I sent Wei Zimu out. When I was near the door, I stopped and looked at him. If I had not left 7 years ago, I would still be that vulgar person who was born as a maid. Wei Zimu, you would probably hate me even more now than you did 7 years ago. He is just like his father. His persistence over the years is only because of his biased love. If one day he no longer leans towards them, he will be unwilling. If I had not left, there would be no Wang family, but there would still be Li family and Zhang family. If I hadn't been so lucky today, I'm afraid the Wei family might have forced me to enter the mansion again to fulfill the young master and the marquis's reluctance over the past few years. What if they get bored? It's just a repetition of the scenes 7 years ago. Wei Zimu's eyes were red and he cried, "No, it's not like that. I was too young before, and I didn't understand. But that was not my intention. Grandma always said that you were of a low status, and other people's mothers were not like that. I also wanted a mother from a big family, and I never wanted to drive you away. Muir was wrong. I really know I was wrong, Mother. Can you please forgive me?" I told him, It's not about forgiveness. I didn't blame you 7 years ago. I just stopped liking you from then on. There is only a shallow bond between you and me as mother and son." The carriage from the Wei mansion had already arrived at the door, and I whispered, "You can go now." Wei Zimu cried and grabbed my clothes tightly, refusing to leave. Wei Li got off the carriage and looked at him coldly. "Let go." He glanced at the hand I held with Xian Jingnian and curled his lips. "Why are you pestering her? If you have the guts, die in front of her and see if she will have any pity on you." Xian Jingnian frowned. "Wei Li, he is your son." "So what?" Wei Li said indifferently, "You are a piece of trash that can't keep people." I took 2 steps toward the stairs, came up to Wei Li, raised my hand, and slapped him hard. He turned his head away, a trace of blood flowing from the corner of his mouth. I should have given him this slap 7 years ago. Now he is even more disgusting. He suddenly grabbed my hand and said harshly, "Hit me. If you can't bear to leave him, then beat me to death. Come on." Xian Jingnian stuffed the stunned Wei Zimu into the carriage and kicked him to the ground. "Take your son and get out." Wei Li reached out and grabbed the hem of my skirt, using all his strength to say, "Songwan, my child, is it that unbearable? You can abandon it if you want." I never answered him what was so unbearable. 14. Wei Zimu got on the carriage, and after coming to his senses, he begged Wei Li in a low voice, saying that he wanted his mother. Wei Li looked at him with a smile, then turned away and said indifferently, "What else do you want me to do? She has a husband and a child. Do you want me to kill her husband and child and then snatch her away? Or do you want me to push the child into the pond like you did, and then I can get her mercy?" Wei Zimu's whole body was cold, and his fingers were shaking. Even his father could guess what he was thinking at that time, but as for her, he didn't dare to think about it anymore. On the day we set out back to Longchuan, many officials came to see us off. Xianlang was young, and his arms were filled with little toys given by his uncles and aunts. He accepted them while expressing his gratitude obediently. I saw Wei Zimu in the crowd. He hadn't been here for a long time since that day. When he saw me looking over, he turned his head away. I paused, then turned around and got into the carriage. Xian Jingnian was teasing his son in the car, and I looked out the window. The team returning to Longchuan was getting farther and farther away, and the grand and prosperous capital city was already left behind. I have no attachment to the capital city. Life here is not that good for me. On the contrary, Longchuan has simple folk customs and beautiful scenery. Moreover, there are what I think about and love, as well as the work of taking care of women and children and medical affairs waiting for me. Longchuan welcomes me more than the capital. Extra. Wei Li. Wei Li sometimes asked himself, how much does he like Songwan? He seemed to like her, but not that much. Perhaps it was the days when they depended on each other that made him dependent. In those difficult days, the young girl always blinked her bright eyes and kept saying, "You must live, Wei Li." He also believed that he loved Songwan very much. He could even ignore her family background and force her to be his wife. But he didn't seem to like her that much. Otherwise, how could he bear to watch her suffer so much in the mansion? On the second day of her wedding, the nanny beside Madame Wei came over hurriedly to teach her the rules. She bit her lip, her legs trembling, and knelt outside old Madame Wei's door for 2 hours. It's not that he didn't see it, but he told himself that if Songwan wanted to become the wife of a wealthy family, she would have to go through this. If she doesn't endure these hardships, how can she be worthy of me in the future? But when he looked at the scar on her knee, he couldn't bear it and decided to go and plead with his mother in person. However, Songwan pulled him, and under the red candlelight, with a pretty face, she said with a smile that it was no problem. She gestured with her fingers and told him that in the future she would also learn etiquette, accounting, housekeeping, poetry, calligraphy, and some incense. She heard that these were popular among the nobles in the capital. Once she had learned them well, she would be able to go out for him. He remained silent. She should learn, otherwise, others would see through her ignorance and contempt. But both he and she were thinking too naively. The nobles who come to Beijing will not treat you as the same kind of person just because you have learned a little bit of incense. Even if they treated her with courtesy on the surface for Wei Li's sake, They would make fun of the wife of the Marquis of Wei to their husbands behind closed doors, which was really not acceptable. Gradually, he stopped caring about her suffering, thinking that this was what she should do. So, Madame Wei found fault with her in every way and asked her to endure it, and he just watched. In the cold winter, Madame Wei caught a cold and was feeling unwell, so she was asked to go to the temple to pray in the snow. When the boiled medicine was brought to her, it was either too hot or too scalding. She just lowered her head and boiled it over and over again. These things, which he had previously turned a blind eye to, now came over mountains and across rivers, making him bend over. He even used Wei Zimu to control her, so how much did he like her? He spoke harshly to her, asking her parents' beloved child to make long-term plans. After hearing this, she stopped struggling, slowly put down her hands, and let her take the child away. Is it true that she is not good at educating her children? No. He turned his former love into a sharp sword, and after getting used to her enduring in silence, he did whatever he wanted. Later, in order to see her child more often, she would go to him and try to please him. Occasionally, he would show mercy and take her to Quizhuxuan to watch her play with the children with joy in her eyes. Wei Li thought he loved her, and only her. Marrying Wang was not because of the lingering relationship between childhood sweethearts, but the result of him weighing the pros and cons. He was also confident that Songwon would not become estranged from him because of this. She has endured so much hardship, what else can't she endure? But in the end, he overestimated himself and overestimated Wei Zimu. During those years, every time he saw Wei Zimu's face, his heart ached. Sometimes he would act like a madman and say to the child, "You drove your mother away. She doesn't want you anymore. You are a child no one wants. Are you satisfied?" But when he is sober, he will apologize to him. Wei Zimu grew up day by day in such fear. Wei Li told him that his mother liked children with good character and great talents. He studied hard and tried his best to be a good person. He wanted to find his mother so that his father would not be angry with him. But no one expected it. The Songwon who came back again was Songwon. She became someone else's wife, someone else's mother, and they called her a rare treasure. From now on in this life, there will be endless flowers and infinite moons. There is no fate between them anymore. Over.